Well, looks like Primary Arms has some competition in the budget LPVO arena now. Hey, what's going on, fellas? Welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to talk about my favorite subject, at least according to the comments, the budget LPVO. And for that category, you guys know that we spend a lot of time with Vortex topics, more specifically the PST and the Razor 1-6. But there was another one all the way back to 2016, almost 10 years ago now, called the Strike Eagle 1-6. Back then it was the only low budget 1-6 LPVO available, and it was halfway decent, with the emphasis on halfway, because really it was okay for its price range, but if you spent a little bit more money, you probably would have been a little bit happier. So fast forward to now, almost 10 years later, and there are a lot of budget LPVOs available, so Vortex has a lot of competition in this arena now. So if you were to ask me, hey man, what's the best budget LPVO available right now? I would not hesitate and say, hey, it's the Primary Arms 1-6 Nova. However, Vortex wouldn't take that line down because of course they're going to upgrade their own budget option with this one, the Vortex Venom 1-6. So knowing that I spent some time with this Vortex Venom, can I say that this now unseats the Nova 1-6 as the best budget LPVO? Well, I'd say that each one has its strengths and weaknesses, which we'll look at in more detail now. So let's go. So starting with length, they're both around 10 inches long, so they're not really compact and not overly long either. So you still got plenty of room on the rail if you want to run a thermal clip on if you're so inclined. Now, weight-wise, the Vortex Venom is a little bit heavier. I think it comes in at 19.6, and the Primary Arms 1-6 is 17.9. Can you feel the difference between those two when you're running around? Well, I'd say considering that the weight difference is around 3 rounds of 223, there's no way you're gonna be able to tell. So as far as scope tube, they're both exactly the same, 30 millimeters in diameter. So for the Primary Arms, you guys know that I've used the Warren QD mounts earlier because I found those to be a good value and they work really well. For this video, just because I want to keep the same height as my scope switch, I'm using a 193 with that really cheap Amazon Discovery mount, which I was curious whether it would hold up. And surprise, surprise, it held up. It didn't move around or anything at all. So considering what it costs, that was really a nice surprise. But for the Venom, I'm running the antimatter scope switch, which you've seen from prior videos, which allows me to run the magnification dial with my support hand just staying on the handguard, which is really nice and saves me time. The only bad part about it is it does add a little bit of weight. So the antimatter scope switch comes in at 10 ounces extra. So it's a little bit more than if you had a dedicated scope ring. Okay, so with the initial looks out of the way, we'll go ahead and talk about glass and illumination now. All right, fellas, so for assessing glass quality, I always say start at 1x because typically that's the default setting for most LPVOs. I first look at glass quality and edge clarity and look for any signs of distortion. So starting at 1x, I start at the center and start pushing out to the edge. How far do I get to the edge before I start seeing distortion setting in? If I'm comparing both the Vortex Venom and the Primary Arms, I'd say that I cannot distinguish the difference between the two at 1x. Both pretty clear at 1x. I mean, distortion is only right there at the very edges, maybe the last 10% or so. Most second focal plane scopes are clear at 1x, so that's largely not a differentiator. Now, one area that I'm seeing right away though, as far as like the difference between those two, you'll kind of make it out if you were to do these side by side, is the field of view and the bezel thinness. So spec-wise, you can actually see it on the website that the Vortex Venom is a little bit wider and also the bezel is a little bit thinner. Disregarding illumination, all that stuff, but as far as field of view and the flatness of the image of 1x, I think the Vortex Venom is pretty close to the Razor 1-6 in that regard. Now, if you were compare it to the Primary Arms Nova, the Primary Arms Nova is a little bit thicker and is not as flat. So the experience of looking at the Primary Arms 1x is more of a tunnel effect versus what you see in the Vortex Venom. So for field of view and the bezel size, the Vortex Venom for sure. Okay, one area where you start to really see some distance between the Venom and the Primary Arms Nova is as you start to zoom up from 1x to 6x or even at 3x, you'll start to notice the glass is a little bit clearer and a little bit less foggy with a little bit less distortion than the Primary Arms. You can kind of see it as you step through the magnifications. So you'll see in the test footage that trees or branches, you can look at them on the corners, you can see that it's a little bit less mushy than what you see in the Primary Arms Nova. So for sure, long range glass, the Vortex Venom is definitely better. I'd say like if you give the Primary Arms a 6 in that regard, the Vortex Venom probably 7, 7.5. So when we're talking eye relief and eyebox, so the stats wise say that the Primary Arms is longer at 4 inches versus the 3.7 on the Vortex Venom. Now, can you really notice that when you're shouldering the rifle? Well, for me, you know, I like to run the stock all the way out. So For me, the priming arms is a lot more intuitive. When I shoulder the gun, I can see the full sight picture right away, as opposed to the Vortex Venom, where I have to move my head just a little bit slightly forward in order to see a full sight picture. Now, when it comes to the eyebox, they're both 1:6 and 24mm objective lenses, and I didn't find any difference between them. Typically, you see those differences in eyeboxes when you're running it like a stairs or VTAC drill. And I did that for both of these optics at 6X, and I can tell you that I didn't see any difference between them. So when it comes to eye relief and eye box, probably I'll give it to the priming arms Nova, since it is a little bit longer. And finally, to the biggest difference between these two optics, the daylight brightness or the illumination. So back in the 2016 video, the Vortex Strike Eagle had a big bold reticle, but it was not daylight bright. It was kind of daylight red in some instances, but if you're shooting to shadow or dark areas, well, you had a problem seeing the reticle sometimes. So fast forward 10 years, has Vortex improved upon that technology? And the short answer is no. So basically, it's still not a daylight bright reticle. Sometimes in lighting conditions like this, where it's kind of cloudy, it's daylight red, you can see it easily. But if once it gets sunny and you turn the thing to max, you cannot really see the reticle turn red. So if you're like in a dark, shadowy area, like maybe in a forest, you'll see it a little bit better. But hey, if you get into any sun at all, it's gonna be hard to see that center dot. Now compare that with the priming arms Nova, which were their big change from their Gen 3 to Gen 4, is the inclusion of a daylight bright reticle. So it has a fiber optic wire reticle that's lit with splashback on it. So that thing is very bright. So even under the brightest noon daylight, you can turn it on to the full power and you can use target focus shooting and shoot it like a red dot. It's actually brighter than the Razor 1:6, which is usually the gold standard in LPVO. So it has no problems, except for maybe like you're shooting like a white target and like high noon, then it'll wash out, right? Pretty much all LPVOs will do that. So when comparing these two, when it comes to illumination, for sure, the priming arms Nova wins out. Okay, so now that we talked internals, we'll go back out a little bit, we'll talk controls and externals. All right, fellas, so when it comes to controls and the exteriors of the scope, just in general, the Vortex Venom is a little bit nicer than the priming arms Nova. The scope body is very close to what you'd see in a Vortex PST, so they kind of just ported that over to this Vortex Venom. First thing you're gonna notice are the turrets. So the turrets are low profile cap design. They're very nicely machined, and also when you playing with the turrets themselves, you'll notice they're very similar to the PST. The lettering is easy to see, everything's labeled properly. Each click is a quarter MOA instead of half MOA in the PST, so it's even an improvement on the Vortex Venom. And when you have the caps off and you're moving the turrets around, the clicks feel good. Really, the only bad thing I can say about it is stiff, just like the PST, so you do have to take a little bit more force than you're used to in order to make an adjustment. So when you look at the priming arms Nova, they work well. They're the same low profile design, but you can tell like the machining is not as nice. And when you're moving the turrets around, they're definitely not as clicky or tactile. So given those limitations for the priming arms, I'd say like those turrets are only for zeroing. Once you make an adjustment, put the caps back on, don't make any more adjustments on the clock. So between them, for sure, the Vortex Venom wins out when it comes to turret. So one other big difference that you notice between the two is the magnification adjustment ring, or the throw lever or the zoom lever, whatever you want to call it. Now for the Venom, it has ribs along the ring, so that gives you a little bit more torque in order to turn the ring. And you'll definitely need that because they're very similar to the PST, when it's kind of stiff to move around, although with use I noticed it's slightly loosened up. And as you notice here, I'm running with the antimatter scope switch, which I mentioned earlier, and this scope switch only works as well as this zoom ring as far as stiffness. So if your zoom ring is stiff, then it's going to be stiff to move this around. So if you're doing a lot of transition work with the Vortex Venom, you're probably better off with the piggyback or an offset RDS. But for the priming arms Nova, as you saw in the previous video, comes with a throw lever, so the Vortex Venom does not, so which is really nice. That throw lever is a little bit sharp and sticky, so you basically have to use your thumb to move it around. As far as pressure to move it around, it's a little bit smoother than the Vortex PST. So for that one, I've run that one on the clock with the antimatter scope switch and a match. It did help. So knowing that, if I had to choose one, I'd say I'd choose the priming arms throw lever, since it comes with integrated throw lever, and also the friction to move it is a little bit easier than the Vortex Venom. And lastly, one small difference between the two is we're talking illumination control here on the left-hand side. So the Vortex Venom has 6 levels with an off position in between. They are clicky, so there's plenty of friction to move around. The only big difference here is the Vortex Venom, since it only has 6 levels, the levels are coarser. When you move to 5 to 6, there's a big jump in brightness. In contrast to that, the primary arms has 1 to 10 levels, so it has much finer controls between them. So I'd say that for sure the primary arms is the better illumination control level between the two. All right, fellas, so that's both the interior and exterior looks at both of them in comparison. So now we'll take a look at how these perform in the field. All right, fellas, so when we're talking field use, we'll look at the reticle, both 1X and 6X. So first, when we look at the Venom reticle has T-bars at both 3, 6, 9 to kind of help drive your eye toward the center reticle. And the center reticle is a big half circle. So it's got a semicircle on the top, and that semicircle measures, I think, 16.6 MOA. So basically, if you were to put this on an IPSC target at 10 yards, that would fit inside an A zone. So basically, if you were to use just a big circle for bracketing, then you will be sure you'll get an effective A zone shot. But if you take it out to 25, that big semicircle fills up the entire target, so you really can't use it for bracketing once you get to 25 yards. So one thing I'll say about this reticle is even though it's not daylight bright, it is a big, bold reticle, like its older brother, the Strike Eagle, so you can see the reticle, and especially in second focal plane, at all times. So it works well even without illumination. Where daylight bright illumination will kind of hurt you in this scope is if you need to shoot something with a small 1 MOA dot, it's kind of hard to see certain lighting conditions. So in contrast, when we look at the primary arm of Nova, it's a much simpler reticle. It's a crosshair reticle, so you got big, thick bars at both the sides and top and bottom, which help guide your eye quickly to the center. And even without illumination, the lines are thick enough to still shoot in most lighting conditions. But since it is Nova reticle, we can still turn on illumination when we need that bright dot to shoot quickly. And even when you have that bright dot on, you can compare it at 10 yards and at 25 yards. It's small enough to where basically you can shoot headshots with this reticle between 25 and 50 yards if you needed to, because the reticle is still small even with illumination on. At 1X, for sure, the primary arms is the better reticle. So knowing that, what happens when you zoom up, the situation becomes reversed. So basically with the Vortex Venom, it just gives you more when it comes to the reticle. So for example, in the Venom, they give you a ranging reticle at the top, very similar to primary arms. That ranging reticle is calibrated for 18-inch shoulder width, so you put that thing on an IPSC target and it fits inside one of those lines, it's that many yards away. And when you look at the primary reticle itself, the center BDC, this is a BDC reticle, the AR BDC3 they call it. Even though I prefer mil reticles, this BDC is well thought out and it works well. So it's got a very small 1 MOA center dot, so you can zero it very precisely. And the drops are labeled so you can see it easily when you're shooting it under fire. Now Vortex does make their subtension detail, i.e. the spacing between those lines, public. And why that's important is because the ballistic calculators like Chair Gun, they have this reticle. So that's important because if you look at the manual, hey, this says AR BDC reticle should be 0 to 50 to 200 yards. But as you know, if you've seen my LPVO zeroing video, you should chrono your ammo. So you can find exactly what your bullet is doing in your upper that you're using. Knowing that, if you plug in my numbers with 6.9 grain ammo at a 16-inch Criterion, you know that if I just stick with a 100-yard zero, then my spacing between the subtensions is in 50 yards each. So with the field test, as I'm shooting this under long range, you can see that that 1 MOA reticle is actually very precise, so it has no problems hitting these small 6-inch targets from 100 to 200 yards. Once you get past 300 yards or so, this reticle has wind holes between 5, 10, 15 miles an hour. That's very helpful. You start to shoot in windy conditions, which I did on that day. There we go, hit. Probably over here somewhere. All right, nice. So when it comes to the Nova at long range, well, if the Vortex is more, then the Nova is less. So it's got a simpler reticle. And the fact of the matter is simpler reticles are easy to shoot, faster to shoot at 1X. But when it comes to long range, they're not as full featured, so they don't give you as much data. So the nice thing about the Nova is a mil-based reticle. So you get 5 mils down with the big hashes, and you also get half mils in between them. So you get plenty of precision no matter how far you need to take this. Additionally, it does not have a ranging reticle like the Vortex Venom does at the top. However, the lines on the ladder are calibrated for 18-inch widths. So you can put that on a target and that will tell you the range in yards. And one difference between primary arms and Vortex is primary arms does not publish their subtension detail. So you really don't know what this reticle is measured out between the subtensions. So what you have to do is, since it's not published, the ballistic calculators don't have this reticle. You have two choices. You can either build your own reticle, both Cherrigan and Strelick support this, or you just build your target list, type in the range of your target, do calculate, and write that down on a target list so you know how far to hold. Now, as far as shooting this in the field at long range, well, you can see that it is a crosshair reticle, so it's just as fine, just as easy to shoot at small targets. Out to 200 yards is still 6 inches, no problem. Once you get 300 yards or so, just remember this does not have any wind holes. So basically, you have to use Kentucky wind. I shot on a really windy day with this primary arm, so I was okay at 300 yards, but once I got 400, 500, and 600 yards, I started to have misses. So if you can see your miss, then hold that direction and eventually you'll hit the target that you're aiming at. So it should be pretty obvious by now that the Vortex Venom clearly has the better and more capable long-range reticle. For sure, you can still use the Nova reticle. You've seen me do it in this 1:6 video, and the 1:8 video just takes a little bit more work, and in winding conditions, it's not the best. So pull out your Vortex when that's the case. All right, fellas, so for final thoughts on this optic, if you've been keeping a tally, it looks like they're both pretty even as far as like which categories are worse, which categories are better. However, there's one category which we haven't talked about yet, which is pricing. So the Vortex Venom is cheaper than the PA 1:6 Nova. I wouldn't say quite a bit, depending on your budget, but it is cheaper. And for some, pricing is the deciding factor, so that'll make the choice easier. But if price isn't your primary factor, then you have to decide what is your priority. And I think based on that, the choice is pretty easy. So for run and gun, emphasis on 1x CQB distances with a little bit of long range, then the primary arms 1:6 Nova is still the optic to beat. However, if you're shooting a little bit of long range, that's where you're gonna spend most of your time. You're shooting this from the bench with just a little bit of short range. Maybe you're gonna shoot with a piggyback or an offset dot. So your priority is not on 1x, then the Vortex Venom is what you need to look at. So if I were to give out an award for most improved optic, it would be this optic coming from the Strike Eagle. Considering since the Strike Eagle is always recommended as, hey man, it's good for its price range, but now you can just say, hey man, the Vortex Venom 1:6 is a good optic, so no reservations there. All right, fellas, so that's it for me. Thanks for joining us again. If you found this video useful, please sure to click like, comment, and subscribe. I really appreciate it. Thanks again. We'll see you guys again next time.